I got an urgent message from my daughter, Emma, who was visibly upset about her mom's behavior. Even through the choppy video call, I could sense her anxiety. She told me that her mom, Sarah, had been spending several nights a week with a guy named Martin Harris. He's the town councilman, big shot around here, drives a flashy car, and occasionally rolls up in a limo. Emma described him in detail and confirmed her worst fears. She was clearly disturbed, and I did my best to calm her down, promising that I'd come home as soon as I could. Emma begged me to be careful about handling the situation and dealing with her mother. I reassured her that I'd do everything I could and told her I loved her before hanging up. My name is Mike Turner. I'm 42 years old, working as a project manager for a tech company that designs innovative software. I'm also a captain in the National Guard, currently on a long-term deployment in Iraq, serving with the command team. I've been married to Sarah, the love of my life, for 18 years, and we have a beautiful 15-year-old daughter, Emma. Sarah is 40, but could easily pass for someone younger. She's stunning, 5 feet 6 inches with a toned figure that only seemed to get better after Emma was born. Her dark hair falls to her shoulders, and her brown eyes light up when she smiles, which is often. Our marriage has always been rock solid. Even during my deployments, we've stayed close, and our time together has been loving and passionate. There was never a question in my mind about her loyalty, just as she's never doubted mine. But now I wasn't sure what was going on. I immediately filed for emergency family leave and managed to get a flight home. 24 hours later, I found myself at the car rental place back in my hometown, ready to head to the house on a Friday night around 7 p.m. The early December chill hung in the air as I parked my car down the block, out of sight. The street was dimly lit, the lamps casting long shadows across the sidewalk. I could see the lights on inside the house, kitchen, living room, and upstairs bedroom, just like normal. I watched as Sarah moved around, getting ready to go out. I discreetly called Emma's phone. After a couple of rings, she picked up, speaking quietly. I asked if her mom was heading out, and she confirmed it. Sarah had been in her room for over an hour, getting ready, and Emma sensed the excitement in her. She was upset, not understanding why her mother would put us through this. I told her not to jump to conclusions just yet, that we needed the full picture before we could act. Emma asked what I planned to do, and I mentioned that I was going to follow them first, then figure out what needed to happen. She urged me to be cautious and asked if I was going to change clothes. I chuckled and told her I'd stick with my military gear. We shared a quick "I love you," and I assured her we'd figure things out together. Not long after, a sleek black sedan pulled into my driveway. Out stepped a tall, slim guy in a tailored suit. Martin Harris, no doubt. He didn't go straight to the door, though. Instead, he leaned against the car, talking on his phone. A minute later, the upstairs lights went off, and I saw Sarah step outside. She made sure the door was locked, then hurried over to Martin with a smile that cut right through me. Even though she looked gorgeous, my heart broke as I watched her glance back at the house to make sure Emma wasn't watching. Then, Sarah kissed him. It wasn't just a quick peck, either. It was warm, like she meant it. After that, he helped her into the car, and they drove off. I managed to stay calm, pulling out my phone to snap a picture of them. I followed their car from a safe distance, staying unnoticed as they weaved through town. Eventually, they pulled into the parking lot of the Lakeside Inn. I parked a little ways away and watched as they got out and walked into the building, arms around each other like a couple in love. It was clear from how they acted that this wasn't something new. They looked like they'd been together for a while, and I took another picture of them entering the hotel. I threw on my camouflage cap and some sunglasses, trying to blend in as I followed them inside. Once in the lobby, I couldn't see them anymore, but that didn't bother me. I walked around casually, receiving a few nods of thanks for my service, which I acknowledged with a quick smile. I glanced at the event board and noticed a holiday fundraiser for the local hospital on the 3rd floor. There was music playing, couples milling about, so I took the stairs, figuring it was less risky than the elevator. When I reached the 3rd floor, I heard the music growing louder and peeked into the ballroom. Sure enough, there they were, Sarah and Martin, acting like a happy couple, mingling with the other guests. At one point, Sarah looked in my direction, but she didn't recognize me. She thought I was halfway around the world, battling desert winds and insurgents. One thing that caught my eye, She wasn't wearing her wedding rings. I continued past the ballroom and ducked into the restroom, locking myself in one of the stalls. Sitting there in silence, I struggled to process what I had just witnessed. For all these years, I thought our marriage was unshakable, but apparently, I was wrong. While I was away, fulfilling my duty, Sarah was betraying me. How could she? How could the people they were meeting with not notice? Didn't anyone realize that the woman hanging on to Martin was married to a soldier? Tears stung my eyes, but I brushed them away. This wasn't the time for self-pity. I had a situation to handle, and I needed to stay focused. Right now, I was facing a much different enemy than I ever had in Iraq. And this battle was going to be personal. I waited until the ballroom festivities were in full swing before making my move. Slipping through the doors, I kept to the edges, sticking close to the wall to avoid drawing too much attention. Only a few people near the entrance seemed to notice me, but I stayed out of sight, far from the bar and buffet tables, hiding behind a large pillar. From this spot, I had a good view of the room. Though I didn't have a ticket for the event, my military uniform was enough to bypass the formalities. The young guy collecting tickets gave me a quick salute and said, "Welcome, sir." I thanked him and entered the ballroom. The thought crossed my mind. If only my wife and her lover showed the same respect for me that this stranger did. It took me a few minutes to locate Sarah and Martin. They were on the dance floor, moving slowly to the music, her arms around his neck, her head resting against his chest, and his hands possessively gripping her waist. I clenched my fists but managed to snap a few more pictures. The urge to rush out there and punch him square in the face was overwhelming, but I held back. As much as I wanted to give him a piece of my mind, or better yet, break his jaw, that wouldn't solve anything. If I acted on impulse, I'd end up in jail, which would only make things worse. No, I needed solid proof, evidence I could use when the time came for revenge. The kind of revenge that would hit them where it really hurt. After the song ended, they stayed close, arm in arm, making their way back to their table. I watched them share another intimate kiss and a few whispered words, capturing every moment with my phone. I'd seen enough for the moment, so I slipped out of the ballroom and found a seat in the hallway where I could keep an eye on both the doors and the elevators. My training as an Army officer had taught me the value of patience, and it paid off. 2 hours passed as I waited, watching as couples began to filter out, laughing and chatting as the event wrapped up. Finally, I spotted Sarah and Martin making their exit. They paused just outside the ballroom doors, talking softly. After a minute or two, they smiled at each other and made their way to the elevators. But instead of heading down like most of the guests, they pressed the button to go up. That caught my attention. I was sitting less than 15 feet from them, dressed in my camo fatigues with my name patch clearly visible. Most of the people at the event had smiled or waved at me as they passed, but Sarah and Martin were so wrapped up in each other that they didn't even notice me. I watched them step into the elevator, hand in hand, and checked the display as it stopped on the 12th floor. After confirming the elevator hadn't come back down, I approached the registration desk. I introduced myself to the attendant and flashed my military ID, explaining that I had an urgent message for Councilman Harris. She hesitated at first, but, after a moment of consideration, gave me his room number, 1215. I rode the elevator to the 12th floor, quietly stepping out and locating room 1215. The hallway was empty, so I pressed my ear against the door, but all I could hear was faint conversation. Unsatisfied, I backed away and propped the stairwell door open with my jacket, ensuring it wouldn't lock. I had a long wait ahead. Emma had told me her mother usually returned home between 2 and 3 in the morning, though once she came back as late as 7. Glancing at my watch, it was just after midnight. Through the small window in the stairwell door, I kept my eyes locked on their room. My mind raced, trying to focus on the task, but I couldn't stop the thoughts from creeping in. I kept imagining that man with my wife, his hands on her, taking what she had promised to me alone. The thought of them together, entwined, made my stomach turn. I could say my heart was broken, but that didn't begin to cover the depth of the pain. It felt like my entire world was crumbling beneath me, the love of my life slipping away. I reminded myself that I had to stay strong, for Emma's sake. But it was almost unbearable knowing that, right at that moment, the woman I loved more than anything in this world was with another man, giving him everything she used to give me. Tears welled up, but I wiped them away. I couldn't afford to break down now. Around 1:30 a.m., I stepped out of the stairwell and returned to their door. This time, I could hear the unmistakable sound of moaning through the door, followed by Sarah's voice, clear as day. "Yes, Martin. Just like that. You're so good." My heart shattered, and tears streamed down my face as I staggered back to the stairwell, barely able to stand the weight of what I had just heard. I waited, knowing they'd eventually come out. At 2 a.m., I positioned myself near their door, phone ready to capture everything. 15 minutes later, I heard the chain being removed and the door opening. I hit record as they stepped out, Martin's arm around her shoulders, Sarah leaning against him with a satisfied smile. She looked fresh, as if nothing was wrong, while he had a smug look plastered across his face. They kissed quickly and turned toward the elevators. It was then that Sarah spotted me leaning against the wall, arms crossed, my face expressionless. I couldn't resist. I confronted her right there. "Enjoy your night, Sarah?" I asked, my voice cold. She stopped dead in her tracks, her hand flying to her chest as if she couldn't believe what she was seeing. Shock spread across her face, and for the first time in months, she was speechless. She collapsed to her knees, her voice trembling as she begged for forgiveness, saying that none of this was supposed to happen and that I was never meant to find out. Her lover, Martin, stood there for a moment, trying to process what was going on. He finally stammered out that it wasn't what it looked like, claiming Sarah was merely helping him with his political campaign. I couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity, sarcastically commenting on the irony of using infidelity as a campaign strategy. I questioned his morals, bringing up how my marriage had been shattered while I was thousands of miles away serving my country. Martin, flustered, tried to distance himself from the situation, insisting there was nothing improper going on, urging Sarah to back him up. But Sarah, still on her knees, didn't play along. She broke down, recounting the kisses, the moans, and all the things I had heard with my own ears from outside the door. It was too late for them to talk their way out of this. I sighed, feeling the weight of defeat. I looked Martin dead in the eyes and told him, "Well, I guess she's yours now." My frustration boiled over as I called them both cowards, reminding them that even my daughter knew about their affair. Martin stood there speechless, unsure how to respond, while Sarah sobbed at his feet. I turned to her and told her not to bother coming home tonight. She might as well spend the night with her lover. I let her know I'd be filing for divorce on Monday, and I'd have no problem bringing this mess to the attention of the press if necessary. I made it clear that I wasn't just angry about what they had done to our marriage, but also how Martin was running the town. Before walking away, I told Sarah she should stay away until I left on my 30-day leave, after which she could decide what to do with her life. Sarah tried to plead with me, begging for forgiveness and asking me not to tell Emma, our daughter, about what had happened. But I coldly reminded her that Emma already knew everything. I couldn't understand why Sarah had done this, but I told her that she had made her choice. With a heavy heart, I walked toward the elevator, ignoring her tearful apologies. Seeing them together only fueled my anger further. I left them behind with a bitter goodbye and stepped into the elevator, ready to leave it all behind. When I got home, Emma was waiting for me, her face puffy from crying. She rushed into my arms, clinging to me like she never wanted to let go. "I missed you so much, Dad," she whispered. I hugged her tightly, telling her I felt the same. I gently broke the news, confirming that I had found her mother with Martin. Emma nodded, her face showing no surprise. "I figured as much," she said quietly. "I felt like she's been ignoring me for months now." She then asked if she could come with me to Iraq, her voice tinged with desperation. I tried to explain that she needed to stay here, where it was safe. But Emma shook her head, saying she couldn't live with her mother anymore. She was angry, angrier than I had realized. Despite everything, I reminded her that Sarah was still her mother, though I could see the resentment in her eyes. With tears streaming down her face, she told me she didn't believe her mother loved her anymore. I held her close as she cried, reassuring her that, no matter what, she still had me. After I finally convinced Emma to go to bed, I locked up the house, securing the chains on the doors, just in case Sarah tried to come back. I had no proof that Sarah and Martin had been using any of our bedrooms, but I didn't want to take any chances. I crashed on the couch, even though I couldn't be sure they hadn't been there either. Sleep was fitful. 45 minutes here, half an hour there. My mind constantly spinning with thoughts of what had happened and what was yet to come. I kept thinking about the inevitable confrontation when Sarah came to collect her things. I could have taken the high road and gotten a hotel room, leaving the house to her, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. She was the one who had destroyed our marriage, so she could deal with the inconvenience of being displaced for a while. Let her and Martin play house. Call it a trial run for their new life together. Emma and I slept in until almost noon. I got up first and made coffee, then scrambled some eggs and made toast for the both of us. We ate in relative silence, making small talk as if nothing had happened. After breakfast, I rinsed the dishes and loaded them into the dishwasher. Suddenly, the phone rang. Emma and I exchanged nervous glances before she picked it up. It was Sarah. I could tell by the way Emma spoke to her that the conversation wasn't going well. Emma made no effort to hide her feelings, telling her mother she knew about the affair with Martin and that it wasn't some one-time mistake. She admitted that she had been the one to ask me to come home, saying she felt neglected because of how obsessed Sarah had become with her relationship. Even when Sarah begged her not to hurt Martin's reputation, Emma refused, her voice shaking with frustration and disappointment. After she hung up, Emma shook her head, clearly irritated. "She doesn't even get it," she muttered. "She doesn't understand why you don't want her here." I told Emma that, in time, Sarah would realize the gravity of what she had done, though I wasn't sure it would make a difference. The rest of the day passed quietly. We tried to distract ourselves from the thoughts of Sarah and Martin, but it wasn't easy. Emma and I talked about her future, and I suggested she stay with my mom until my deployment was over, which would hopefully be in another 5 or 6 months. Emma wasn't entirely convinced. She was worried about how her friends would react to the news about her mother, but I told her that real friends would stick by her no matter what. Later in the afternoon, the phone rang again. This time, it was Sarah. I picked up the phone, but as soon as I heard Sarah's voice on the other end, pleading, Mike, please let me explain." I passed the phone to Emma without saying a word. "What, Mom?" Emma's tone was cold and sharp as she held the phone slightly away from her ear, allowing me to catch bits of Sarah's frantic voice. Sarah kept insisting she needed to talk to me, but Emma wasn't having it. She demanded her mother explain her actions over the past 6 months, accusing her of tearing apart our family. Sarah, crying, tried to defend herself, saying it was never her intention to hurt anyone. But Emma's anger only grew, and she didn't hold back. As they argued, I could hear Sarah's sobs through the speaker, pleading for understanding. Emma's disappointment was raw. She emphasized how deeply Sarah's affair had hurt all of us. Sarah eventually shifted the conversation, asking for some personal belongings she'd left behind, specifically clothes and birth control pills. Her voice was filled with regret and frustration. Emma couldn't resist the sarcastic jab, mentioning how inconvenient it would be if Sarah got pregnant with Martin's child, given the scandal it would cause. With biting words, Emma told Sarah she'd pack her things, including her pills and makeup, joking that Sarah would need it to keep up her image as the town's darling socialite. Before hanging up, Emma coldly added that she'd leave Sarah's belongings on the curb for her to pick up. The moment she ended the call, Emma broke down, and I rushed to comfort her, wrapping my arms around her trembling body. She had been tough on her mom, and while I understood her anger, I assured her we would get through this together. After giving her one last squeeze, I left her to gather the things her mother had requested. I retreated to my office, where I could think clearly and focus on the next steps. Drawing on my military training, I began to strategize, treating this situation like a mission that needed careful planning. There were several tasks I had to complete, most of them straightforward. I would need to hire a divorce attorney, cancel all our joint credit cards, get new ones for Emma and myself, and change the beneficiaries on my life insurance and retirement plans to Emma. I also planned to move half the funds from our checking and savings accounts into new ones that only Emma and I could access. However, figuring out how to deal with Martin Harris was a more complex challenge. He deserved consequences for what he had done, and I was determined to expose him for the cowardly, wife-stealing snake he was. It wasn't just personal anymore. It was about protecting my family and ensuring everyone knew who they were really dealing with. Later that evening, around 8 p.m., the phone rang again. When I answered, I identified myself as Mike Turner. The man on the other end introduced himself as Ray Thomas, a member of the city council and an old friend of Martin Harris. His voice was smooth but calculated, and he said he wanted to talk about what he referred to as a little misunderstanding involving me, my wife, and the mayor from the previous night. His casual tone struck me as odd, considering the seriousness of the situation. Ray began by downplaying what had happened, calling it a simple late-night get-together between consenting adults who may have had a bit too much to drink. He seemed confident that a conversation could smooth things over and settle the matter. But I wasn't buying it. I cut him off, making it clear that Martin had been having an affair with Sarah for 6 months while I was deployed in Iraq. I caught them red-handed, and there was no way he could spin it otherwise. Ray paused before acknowledging how difficult the situation must be for me. Still, he expressed hope that we could come to a resolution that would be beneficial for everyone. His wording made me bristle, and I shot back, asking him to clarify who everyone referred to, because as far as I was concerned, my daughter's well-being was my only priority. The rest didn't matter. Ray hesitated again, then mentioned how the mayor was a well-respected figure in the community and that any damage to his reputation could have serious consequences for anyone involved. The not-so-subtle implication hung in the air. He was suggesting that causing trouble for Martin might come back to bite me. I asked him flat out if he was threatening me. Ray quickly backtracked, saying he wasn't making a threat, just pointing out the reality of the situation. He claimed he didn't want to see harm come to me or my family, but his words didn't sit right with me. It was clear he was trying to protect Martin's reputation at all costs, and he didn't care what that meant for me. I took a deep breath and then issued my own warning. Listen carefully, Ray, I said, my voice low and steady. I've spent the last 6 months dealing with the Taliban in the desert. I'm not the kind of guy who backs down from a fight. Martin might think he's untouchable because he's got some local power, but he's never dealt with someone like me. I made it clear that I wouldn't be intimidated by his vague threats or by Martin's position. If they wanted to come after me, they were in for a rude awakening. Ray was silent for a moment, probably taken aback by my response. I could almost hear him recalculating, realizing that I wasn't going to be easily pushed around. I ended the call by letting him know that if Martin wanted a battle, I was more than ready for it. They had no idea who they were dealing with. I pointed out that my soon-to-be ex-wife, Sarah, had failed to warn the mayor about the kind of fallout that would come from getting involved with me. I reminded Ray that I had a strong network of former military buddies living within a 100-mile radius, men who, like me, had no respect for anyone who took advantage of a soldier's spouse while they were deployed. I advised him to distance himself from Martin Harris unless he wanted to get caught up in the consequences of his friend's actions. I made it clear that Martin wouldn't walk away from this unscathed. Ray, trying to defuse the tension, suggested that a generous amount of money might help resolve the situation. I laughed bitterly and shut down the offer immediately. No amount of money could make up for the betrayal and pain Sarah and Martin had caused, especially to my daughter. I told Ray that the only acceptable outcome would be for Martin and Sarah to face the same suffering they'd inflicted on us. I gave him the go-ahead to relay that message to them both. Ray's tone shifted, and he sounded worried. He understood the fallout could be significant and asked if there was any way to avoid things spiraling further. I laid out my conditions plainly. Martin needed to publicly admit to the affair and resign as mayor. Anything less, and I'd make sure everyone knew the truth. Ray seemed surprised at how serious I was, but I assured him I wasn't bluffing. Before ending the conversation, I mentioned that I had to get back to preparing dinner for my daughter. Just then, Emma came in from the garage, letting me know she'd placed her mother's things on the curb. A black Mercedes had rolled by, and someone unfamiliar picked them up. Ray tried to joke, saying that maybe the clothes would end up at Goodwill if the wrong person grabbed them, but I wasn't in the mood to laugh. I told him I'd packed up Sarah's regular clothes, but had hesitated when it came to the more provocative items, like some of her revealing lingerie. Seeing that stuff had made my stomach turn. Emma gave me an understanding nod when I mentioned it, agreeing that it was hard to imagine her mom leading a double life. I suggested that Emma would need to confront her mom directly about all this when the time felt right. She agreed, but we both knew it wouldn't be easy. The weekend passed without any major issues. Emma and I kept busy. She helped with laundry while I focused on the plan to expose Martin Harris for what he really was. First thing Monday morning, I contacted an old friend, John Fisher, who now worked for the local newspaper. We agreed to meet for coffee at Danny's Diner. John had served with me in the National Guard, and we greeted each other warmly. Over coffee, I gave him a heads up about the situation, being careful not to give away too much at once. I told him that a certain town official had been having an affair with the wife of one of our soldiers while that soldier was deployed. I made it clear that the wife wasn't separated or going through a divorce. Her husband had only just found out. John raised an eyebrow, but said he needed to be cautious about accusations. He didn't want to print something that could lead to a lawsuit if it wasn't airtight. When he asked if I had any proof, I slid my phone across the table and showed him the pictures and videos I'd taken. Photos of Martin and Sarah together, intimate and close, looking like a couple on a date. I asked him to blur Sarah's face if the story went public, out of respect for Emma. John understood the gravity of what I was handing him. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, recognizing the potential consequences. I assured him that I was prepared to face whatever came out of this. I had nothing to hide. I told him how Sarah's affair had unfolded while I was halfway across the world, completely unaware. The betrayal was deep, and the fact that it had happened while I was serving overseas only made it worse. John said he'd look into it and verify what he could. I transferred the evidence to his phone. Then we spent a few minutes reminiscing about some of our old comrades who hadn't made it back from our deployment. Before leaving, we shook hands, and I felt confident that John would handle the story with the care it needed. With that out of the way, I moved on to the next step, finding a good divorce lawyer. I spent some time online researching different firms, reading reviews, and asking around for recommendations. After reviewing a few, I decided to go with a lawyer named R.J. Collins, who came highly recommended for handling difficult cases. I scheduled a meeting for that afternoon. When I arrived at the office, I was surprised to find out that R.J. stood for Revenge Joy Collins, a no-nonsense woman in her 50s with a sharp, direct attitude. She wasted no time getting to business, asking how she could help. I told her I needed a divorce, and I wasn't interested in being amicable about it, given that my wife had been cheating on me with the town mayor during my deployment. As I finished explaining, she blinked in surprise, her pen slipping out of her hand and hitting the desk with a soft thud. I confirmed to Joy that the mayor in question was indeed Martin Harris. I then spent the next half hour recounting the entire situation in detail, and she listened intently, occasionally pausing to take notes or ask for clarification. When I mentioned my daughter Emma, Joy asked how she was handling everything. I explained that Emma was deeply hurt by her mother's actions and didn't want to stay with her during my deployment. Considering Emma's age and her feelings, Joy suggested the possibility of having her stay with my mother instead. I agreed, planning to call my mom later to set things up. Our conversation went on for nearly an hour. I provided an overview of our financial situation, and Joy recommended that I discuss potential financial resolutions with Sarah. I explained that after witnessing how close she and Martin had become, there was no chance of reconciliation, and I requested that Joy prepare the divorce papers as soon as possible. Over the next week, Sarah called me 5 times, but I kept our conversations short, promising her I'd update her on the proceedings when the time came. By Friday, Joy let me know the divorce papers were ready, and she asked where I wanted them served. I told her I planned to invite Sarah over to the house on Monday at 2 p.m. while Emma was at school, so she could be served in person. I called Sarah and arranged the meeting. She tried to initiate a conversation, sounding like she was ready to explain her actions, but I cut her off, telling her we could talk more on Monday. Sarah arrived a few minutes early that Monday, and we sat at the kitchen table. Seeing her again, I felt a pang of emotion despite everything that had happened. She looked beautiful, and for a split second, I almost forgot why she was there. I offered her coffee, but she declined, asking for water instead. I told her she'd have the chance to speak, but I also let her know that someone would be arriving shortly to serve her the divorce papers. Her face went pale. I explained that this wasn't the outcome I wanted either, just like I hadn't wanted her affair with Martin. I said it seemed like neither of us would get what we wanted from this situation. Sarah began pleading, asking me to listen to her side of the story, hoping for some kind of resolution. I agreed to hear her out. She began by explaining how she got involved with Martin through his election campaign while I was deployed. Feeling lonely and depressed, she had found comfort in his companionship. She recalled one evening when they attended a campaign dinner together, and Martin suggested she use her maiden name and leave her wedding rings at home to avoid stirring up any gossip. At the time, she didn't think much of it, but looking back, she realized that removing her rings was a mistake. That night, Sarah mingled with people who all assumed she was single. I asked her when the affair officially started. Sarah admitted it didn't happen right away. It began after a night of dancing and a goodnight kiss when Martin dropped her off. She said she was drawn in by the attention and the way Martin made her feel special, especially when I was so far away. It was like being treated like royalty by someone important in the community. I was furious and demanded to know why she'd betray me like that while I was serving overseas. She looked down and admitted she had been confused, missing me but not knowing how to cope with the loneliness. Being around Martin made her feel better, and their outings became more frequent. As their connection deepened, Sarah confessed they began meeting 2 or 3 times a week. One night, after a romantic dinner, Martin invited her back to his place, and though she hesitated at first, she eventually agreed. She said she felt guilty afterward and had asked Martin to take her home. She even claimed that she tried to break it off with him, telling him she loved me and didn't want to continue the affair. But Martin wasn't so willing to let her go. After some time apart, he contacted her, apologizing and saying he missed her. He promised to keep things platonic, assuring her they could just be friends. Sarah, despite her better judgment, agreed to see him again the following weekend. She went on to tell me about an exclusive party Martin took her to, held at a friend's home in a ritzy area of town. It was a small gathering, just a handful of couples, all of them influential figures in the community. During the event, the wife of a prominent doctor pulled Sarah aside, asking how she'd managed to attract Martin's attention. Feeling trapped and unsure of what to say, Sarah lied. She told them she was separated from her husband and going through a divorce. Word of her so-called separation spread quickly through the tight-knit community, and soon everyone assumed that she and I were no longer together. Sarah said she felt like she couldn't escape the lie. One weekend, while Emma was away, Sarah admitted to spending more time with Martin at his place, and their relationship deepened further. She expressed regret for what she had done and the pain it had caused, but her words rang hollow. I sat there in silence for a moment, processing everything she had just said. It was hard to believe how far things had gone while I was overseas, fighting for my country, completely oblivious to what was happening at home. Despite her regrets, Sarah had made her choices. As she sat there, tears in her eyes, I couldn't bring myself to feel sympathy. I stood up, letting her know that while I appreciated her explanation, it didn't change anything. The person serving the divorce papers arrived right on time. Sarah's face crumpled as she accepted the documents, but there was no going back. The damage was done. Sarah sat across from me, tears streaking down her face, admitting that what she had done was the biggest mistake of her life. She wished she could undo it, but she knew that was impossible. When I asked if she had any real feelings for Martin, she hesitated. Sarah admitted she wasn't sure if she loved him, but acknowledged that she had enjoyed the time they spent together. Even when I pressed her with more pointed questions about whether she saw a future with him, marriage, even, she couldn't give me a straight answer. Just then, the doorbell rang. I told her it was likely for her. She walked slowly to the door and confirmed her identity when handed a manila envelope. Inside were the divorce papers. Sarah stood there for a long moment, staring at the envelope, visibly shaken before she finally closed the door and turned back to me. Tears continued to stream down her face as she asked if we were truly finished. I didn't hesitate when I answered yes. Even though she still claimed to love me, I reminded her that what she loved was the life we had built together, and she had thrown that away. I told her that Emma would be staying with my mother until my deployment ended, which only caused her to break down further, overwhelmed with regret. The next morning, the front page of the local paper delivered a headline that rocked the town. A photograph of Sarah leaving a hotel room with Mayor Martin Harris, accompanied by a caption questioning if her husband, stationed in Iraq, was aware of what had been going on. The article recounted the charity event they had attended together and revealed hotel records showing Martin had booked the room for the night. To make matters worse, The paper mentioned unconfirmed rumors that the pair had been meeting regularly over the past 6 months while I was deployed. The story caused an immediate uproar. Within minutes, people all over town were talking about it. Martin's office went into full damage control, releasing statements claiming the story was entirely fabricated. They insisted Martin would never jeopardize a marriage, especially one involving a soldier serving overseas. His team argued that the photograph was doctored, blaming unnamed enemies for trying to smear the mayor's reputation. They promised a press conference later that afternoon to clear everything up. But too many people had already seen Martin and Sarah together over the past few months. They had acted far too comfortable in public for the rumors to be dismissed so easily. Slowly but surely, people started distancing themselves from Martin. Even some of his most loyal supporters anonymously contacted the newspaper to confirm that the affair had been real. They expressed shock and anger upon learning that Sarah's husband had been deployed during the affair, making it all the more egregious. That afternoon, Martin held his press conference. But when he stepped up to the podium, none of his usual backers were there. Only a few of his staff members remained, and even some of them were noticeably absent. The press was there in full force, cameras rolling as Martin delivered a speech filled with indignation. He claimed the allegations were absurd, saying that he and the woman in question were nothing more than acquaintances and that he would never disrespect a soldier or his family. Halfway through his speech, the unexpected happened. Sarah, defiant and tear-streaked, pushed her way through the crowd and reached the microphone. "My name is Sarah Turner," she announced, her voice trembling. "I am the wife of Captain Mike Turner, and for the past 6 months, I've been having an affair with Mayor Martin Harris." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Martin turned toward her, trying to deny the truth, calling her a liar. But Sarah didn't back down. She accused him of pursuing her, even though he knew she was married and that her husband was fighting overseas. Through tears, she apologized directly to me, speaking through the cameras, and then stormed off. Martin was bombarded with questions as the reporters pressed him for answers. Flustered, he turned and stormed back inside City Hall. I can't lie. Seeing everything unfold publicly did some damage to my already fragile ego. I had known the risks when I first reached out to John Fisher, my contact at the newspaper, but I hadn't expected it to hurt this much. The next day, the president of the city council announced Martin's resignation, declaring that the council would manage the city until a new mayor could be elected. I should have felt satisfaction seeing Martin's fall from grace, but all I felt was a deep emptiness. Loneliness consumed me, and I missed my wife in ways I hadn't expected, even after everything she had done. Later that day, John called to inform me that Martin had packed up and left town, not leaving a forwarding address. Sarah, my soon-to-be ex-wife, hadn't gone with him. Over the remaining days of my leave, I spent as much time as possible with Emma. In the last week, I reluctantly allowed Sarah to move back into the house, at least temporarily, while I prepared to take Emma to my mother's place, 60 miles away. We enrolled her in school there, and I promised Emma that I would come back for her as soon as my deployment ended. The following week, I was back on a plane heading to Iraq, carrying a burning anger in my heart. I intended to unleash it on the enemies hiding in the desert. As for Sarah, a few weeks later, she moved in with Martin, and the two of them left town together. Did I return from Iraq? Yes, but not without consequence. I was critically injured in an ambush, and it was Emma who helped me get back on my feet when I came home. I lost one of my legs in the attack, and life hasn't been the same since. Now, I work as a design specialist for a large electronics firm, living with my daughter. From time to time, I speak about the challenges soldiers face after returning home from duty, especially when it comes to betrayal from the ones they love.